Hey, Lee here, helping you become a better plant parent. Let's answer some community questions and help people along their plant journey. The first question is, why do I need something for my Monstera to climb on? Well, Monsteras and other vining plants, they put out aerial roots that help them cling on to other surfaces. And when a Monstera clings onto something and gets lots of good sunlight, that helps mature the plant. And a mature plant gets larger leaves and has more fenestrations. Now, while you don't necessarily need a moss pole because Monsteras can crawl across the ground, you do have to remember that you are living inside a house and you may not want to dedicate that much space to your plant. So you want a moss pole or at least something to climb on so that your Monstera can grow upwards and not outwards. And I have this moss pole right here. That's not really a moss pole. It's just a wooden stake with some burlap and some twine. And I wanted to share just some of my thoughts on climbing poles, but specifically moss poles. And as I'm doing that, I've got a couple more to make. So in general, I do think that moss poles, specifically moss poles, are a little bit overrated. The people who are trying to sell you moss poles basically tell you that in the wild, these plants grow up trees. On the trees there are moss, and the aerial roots will dig in to the moss, and once those aerial roots dig in, it makes the plant more secure, which makes the plant put out larger leaves and more fenestrations. Now, the thing about that is, yes, well, some of that is true. Obviously, there's not moss on every single tree in the wild, but aerial roots are really there to stabilize the plant, and the plant needs to be stabilized from the wind and other elements. Now, if you're putting something in your house, there's obviously not a lot of wind, so really these aerial roots do not need to be that stable. On top of that, for a moss pole to work, it has to be consistently wet. And usually the moss, when it's exposed to open air, because it's on a pole in a circle, it has a lot of open surface area. So that means that your moss pole is more than likely going to dry out extremely quickly. Now, if your moss pole is drying out extremely quickly, that is going to result in you having to actually water your moss pole probably daily, unless you're living in an extremely humid environment, preferably outside. If you can, you may not need to water your moss pole. But if you're indoors living in a typical North American climate, your moss pole is going to dry out extremely quickly, and you're going to have to be watering it for those aerial roots to get any of the benefits from your moss pole. So basically, as the aerial roots are inside the moss, you add extra moisture. The aerial roots can take in more moisture from the moss pole, which leads to a larger plant. And while some people do grow amazing looking moss poles with really, really great plants, the amount of effort and the cost is probably not worth it at all. You can basically use any kind of material. I don't even need to be wrapping these sticks with burlap around them. I'm just trying it for aesthetic purposes, but we'll see if the aerial roots actually go into the burlap. Some would suggest wrapping sphagnum moss inside and then wrapping the burlap around it, but I don't feel like that's necessary either. So if you are looking for alternatives, of course you could make your own moss pole, or you could just get, I've said in the past, a birch bark pole. You could just get a wooden stake. Bamboo stakes are really great because they tend to come in packages of like 20 to 25. You can usually get them pre-cut in 2, 3, 4 to 6 inches already. So those are some very easy options and alternatives. So you're not spending a lot of money, because some of these boutique style moss poles can actually be upwards of $20 to $30, and that's just for 1 or 2 feet. I've also seen a lot of self-watering moss poles, which in theory are great, but if you're indoors and you're not in the type of climate where there's lots of wind, lots of humidity, you are probably looking at getting mold within the moss pole. So something that stays consistently wet is probably not the best idea for the general health of yourself and for the general health of your plants. We don't want these mold growths going on and touching the leaves of your other plant, which could lead to infection, which could lead to spreading throughout your collection, and even possible leading to root issues as well. So if you are growing monsteras, if you're growing philodendrons or pothos, and they do put out aerial roots, having a pole for those plants to climb will be beneficial if you're looking to make the leaves of your plant a lot larger. If you are looking to make your own climbing pole, but specifically your own moss pole, you may not actually be looking at saving a lot of money. The issue with this is if you're buying moss in bulk, especially sphagnum moss, it can be a little bit on the expensive side. So you're having to buy that in bulk. Although you can make a whole bunch of moss poles, you also need to buy the wire to wrap the moss pole, and you also need to buy the stakes in bulk to wrap your moss pole. So after all that, you're probably looking towards a startup cost of around, depends, maybe $50 to $60. Of course, it may depend on which country you're from and where you're shopping, but with all of that, I don't know how many moss poles that you're going to be making. Realistically, I think most people in their homes probably have maybe 2, 3 if they're really hardcore collectors. But if you do need around 10, maybe even more moss poles, then yeah, possibly it might be more economical for you to start making your own. But if you only need 1 or 2, then I would encourage you just to get whatever you need. You can just buy stakes, or if you're looking for something more aesthetic, you can buy whatever you like. Try to support local small businesses if you can. And if not, just get something off Amazon. I'll try to put some links in the description. So if you're looking to make your own, I can help guide you on some of the things that you need. Or if you're looking for some just typical sturdy ones from Amazon, the stackable ones can sometimes be okay. I'll include those affiliate links in the description as well. And the next question is, I've had my fiddly fig for a year. It's never dropped a leaf, no brown spots, but it's not pushing out any new leaves. What did I do wrong? So a full year is a really, really long time for your plant to just be stable, not in decline, and not growing at all. It does depend on how large the plant is. Larger plants, if you buy them, will tend to take a much longer time to start pushing out new growth. But what I would do is I would start looking towards light exposure first. Increasing the light is obviously better for most plants, but low light you would tend to see some kind of yellowing or damaging of the leaves. So it's possible that that isn't the main issue. The other thing that I would look for is checking to see if the plant is root bound. While root bound plants aren't necessarily harmful directly to your plant, it can contribute to some of the stunted growth that you might be seeing. And with that advice, that does not mean as soon as you buy a new plant, I would recommend repotting it. I think when you get a new plant, you should leave it in its original pot, unless there's some serious issues with rot or other watering issues. Just leave your plants alone for at least a few months before you start doing something. So that's the second thing that I would check. And of course, the last thing, maybe the most ridiculous thing, but also the most important one, is the plant real? It's very possible that you have purchased a plastic plant one of those hyper realistic ones that you're so excited to get because it's a great deal, but it is not real. You've just been watering it sparingly. Water in the pot is either just building up or evaporating, but I have unfortunately heard stories of people buying succulents and not realizing that it is a plastic plant for at least 2 years. One story I've heard on Reddit, until they realized that the plant was plastic. They had finally pulled it out and seen the styrofoam. So if you want to double check to see if your plant is real, you know, double check. So right now I have my philodendron micans that is growing really well. It's been maturing up this bamboo pole. Leaves started off pretty small. So with this plant, I'm going to check the roots, see if it needs to be repot, and add a better stake. So looking at this plant, I actually thought the roots would be a lot better. These are not great. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove a lot of this soil and I will repot it in the same size container. So this might be a little bit tricky considering I want to use this stake. I am running out of space kind of with this plant. The bamboo stake is just a little bit shorter than this taller stake here, but once this reaches a certain height, I'm going to start cutting the plant and taking some top cuttings from it. So that'll continue to help it grow. I'm using the same soil for my monsteras and philodendrons. When I go with philodendrons, I tend to make it just a little more on the moisture retaining side, and I add a little bit more potting soil. So I've got my stake in, shove in the roots. Next, I'll just fill in the top, and then finally I will tie this plant back. The micans is probably one of my more favorite vining philodendrons. I really love these velvety leaves, and I'm glad that they're starting to become a lot more common and more people are getting these plants. Now the last part, we gotta stake them up. Sometimes the most frustrating part. Usually when I have to do something like this, I tend to want to start at the top to secure it, like this, and then just get under one of the leaves. Like that. And then once you're there, you can start doing the rest. And the next question is, can you recommend some big houseplants that are easy to take care of? Now, I love really big houseplants, and in my space, I want that jungle look. So if you have a lot of light, some things that I would recommend are a bird of paradise, a monstera, or a rubber tree. Now, when I say if you have a lot of light, I mean you need some really great south, maybe east facing windows if you're in the northern hemisphere. And if you do have a lot of light, those plants will be growing perfectly fine in your space. But if you don't have a lot of light, some things that I might recommend are something like a Dracaena, like a corn plant or a mass cane. Now these plants tend not to get a lot of love. They're not super popular, even though they're in every single houseplant store. They are everywhere. They make great houseplants because they are so easy to handle. You don't need to water them very frequently. Their soil needs are not that challenging, and you don't need to do much to keep them happy. One thing with the Dracaena, I do recommend that you use a good water. So if the tap water in your city is great, tap water is fine. You can also take your tap water, let it sit out overnight. That might help your plant avoid some of the yellowing, especially on the tips of the leaves. But one interesting thing about the Dracaena is you can also cut the tips of the leaves into a triangle to get rid of some of that yellowing, and you won't actually affect how the leaf is photosynthesizing, and you won't change the health of the leaf. So if you're looking for some big plants, just visit a typical plant nursery. You don't really need to get anything super fancy. They sell them large, they sell them for cheap. They've been popular, unpopular for a very long time, and that's why you see a lot of those plants in malls and doctors' offices, because they can just take so much abuse and they don't need a whole ton of care. This last plant that I'm repotting is my neon heart-leafed philodendron, and I got this from a local nursery for a couple bucks. And this plant specifically, I really want it to go on my plant shelf because I have my watermelon peperomia on my plant shelf, and it's really not the best place for it. I've actually propagated that plant several times and given away a lot, so I think it may be time to retire the watermelon peperomia at this point. But because it's on my plant shelf and it's right under my marble queen pothos, the marble queen is draping over it, and the draping is causing it to be blocked from about 80 to 90% of the light. So it's basically not getting much light. It's difficult to see even looking at it now. Leaves are starting to droop, so I need to either find a better place for it or send it to the plant graveyard. While you might get attached to some of your house plants, that's completely reasonable, but if something is not making you happy, don't be shy to just throw it in the trash. If you're worried about being wasteful, you have to consider that all of the carbon emissions that have been spent getting that plant from the grower to the store, all of the emissions that have gone into producing the soil and shipping that soil to the store, all of the times that you've repotted it, that is all taking up energy that has already been spent. So if you are looking to save a plant that is consistently dying out of some kind of guilt or some sort of explanation that you don't want to be wasteful, it's actually probably going to be more economical and better for the environment if you just cut your losses and get rid of that plant now. We are trying not to have a sunk cost fallacy with our plants. If it's not growing well and you don't have the time, or you'd rather create space for a different plant, then just get rid of it. There's no shame. If you have any plant questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. And if you're already part of the community, hi, how's it going? Welcome back. And I would encourage you to try to help others in the comments too, if you have the knowledge. If this video was helpful, give it a like and consider subscribing. See you next time.